So I would like to thank you, Zhijan, very much for being here today and for speaking with us. We're very happy to have you. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Ward for inviting me. Thank you for Professor Han for making me in contact with Dr. Ward. And thank you, Hagar, for this. Otherwise, I was going crazy. And thank you all for having time here. I have always wanted to be here. I've known the studio for so many years. I never had the chance to come here, so thank you for this chance. So today I really, it's a great honor for me to have an introduction, very informal introduction of what the influence of Jackson Pollock and largely the abstract expressionists on the Chinese, because this is a big name, and abstract expressionism is very popular in China, but not always though, not from the 1950s. So, when was it known? When was Jackson Pollock known in China? The very first time Jackson Pollock was known was in 1981, 2 years after China and America signed the formal, I don't know what it is called, some kind of a treaty between China and the United States. Back then, that was after Jimmy Carter was, Donald Reagan was the president, right? And I learned that it was the Department of State. They arranged directly for the exhibition in China from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and included, I know there was Jackson Pollock's work, very first time that arrived in China. But in translation, it was not until much later, formal translation. The most important book, of course, is Arneson's book. You know, we all know, right? This has been the most popular textbook on modern art for 5 decades at least. So I am one of the translators of 2 of the 3 versions of this book. The very first one on the left side, the red one, was published in 1986. I didn't translate anything of that. But the second one, I was one of the major translators of the second book, the blue one. And the third one published in 2020, a few years ago, very thick book. I was the only translator. So it took me quite a few years, like 5, 6 years to get the whole book done. Almost 1,000 pages, as you know. So that's how he kind of was introduced into China. The second question is, when did abstract art start in China? And what it's stated today, it is said, or it is claimed to start in the late 1970s. And a work so far, what we could have is a work by Li Shan. He's actually a very famous artist who does the so-called political pop. I don't know if you guys know anything. This guy, he learned from Andy Warhol, and he redid the Mao face. It was a kind of a very feminine, floral designs. Many of you guys probably have heard of this name. And they had a retrospective of early Shanghai abstract art a few years ago. And then he was asked to participate. I know this guy very well. He's like 81, 82 years old. And the reason why I put a question mark behind 1979 is because a friend said it wasn't signed in 1979. It was signed right before the show opened up a few years ago. So I don't know. So that's why, because everyone wants to be the first abstract artist in China. So by signing this with 79, he could claim to be the first abstract artist in China. Okay, so anyway, but it was just a very few. We have to say, abstract art did not start until the mid-1980s. So 1979 was too early because no one was even aware of abstract art in 1979. As you probably know, the culture revolution just ended a few years ago, right? We're still in Maoism. So anyway, and by later it did not became. Oops. I need your finger. Okay. And so it did not actually start as kind of a movement. For the past 2 decades, abstract art is getting very popular in China, around the world, right? Not just in China, in this country. Like Jerry Saltz, he had a lecture on, he hates abstract art, as we know. And so over the past 2 decades, it has been booming all over China because it's related to the urbanized living environments. As we have a bigger market today, so many people are collecting abstract art. So this was a few years ago. You can count the numbers of these. Some of them were exhibited in 2003. And we have about 50 back then, 10 years ago. Now we have probably around 100 artists who do abstract art. And, well, as we know, China's economy has been doing pretty well for the past 3 decades. But we'll see if the artists will do something else if the economy goes down. I hope not, but we don't know. So how do we understand abstract art in China? Approaching abstract expressionist art in China, I'm not including all abstract art made by the Chinese artists. So abstraction as an alternative and rebellion against socialist realism in the age of reform, starting from the 1980s all the way through the late 1990s. And the key event is for the opening up of China to the rest of the world. Probably many of you guys still remember in 1979, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the top leader of China back then, he made a visit to the United States. He actually went to Texas. He was wearing a cowboy's hat, right? He was on the cover of Time magazine. Back then, that was a signal for the opening of China, communist China, Maoist China to the rest of the world. But the actual reform did not start until the early 1980s. And this is when I went to college. And this is when we remember the 1980s as the golden period in Chinese modern history, although we didn't know that in the 1980s. Now, as China's situation is getting, I don't know if worse or better, I think it's worse than years before. Now we start missing the 1980s. That was the time when everything was opening up. That was the time when we started hearing about modern European American art. And abstraction as a way, the second period, a way of self-expression in a special social and political context. I will show you what context, and probably some of you guys still remember that context. Abstraction is a universal language in the era of globalization, but from a Chinese perspective, the rising Chinese nationalism is at a peak today, which is kind of sad to my generation, which I call the 1980s generation, or the Tiananmen generation. We simply call ourselves Tiananmen generation. So, alternative for decades, ever since 1949, when communists took over China from the nationalists, then China adopted Soviet Union's art policies by saying art must serve the people. And everything is about the people. But at the center of the people is the leader, right? As we see, And that's Mao. You can see this is one of the best known paintings during the Cultural Revolution. So in front of Tiananmen, proudly smiling under the gaze or under the caring gaze of Mao Zedong. That's the idea. And these are the collectives. They're not individuals. And when this work was done, the artist was not even allowed to sign the work. This was done by the people, for the people, right? Under our great leader. So the socialist, the communist art is about socialism. It's about collectivism. But after 1979, especially starting from the 1980s, new generations of artists and young people like us started to know about the outside world. And then we know, oh my God, there are people who are doing art in such a different way. And I went to Beijing Normal University. My first major was actually English language and literature. So I remember the first time I was reading Newsweek magazine, Time magazine. We thought this was something from the sky, right? From a different world. So I was shocked to see some pages were ripped off. So I asked the librarian why this page was ripped off. And they said, oh, this is something bad about China. So you cannot read this page, okay? But anyway, we started to know, what is going on outside of the world. We started to rethink about the legacy left behind by Mao and communists, the legacy of socialist realism. So people like Wu Guanzhong, he's much older. You can see he was born in 1919, and he went to Paris to study in the 1940s. So he is very experienced with foreign art, Western modern art, and he started calling for abstract art. He wrote articles promoting the beauty of abstract art. So he is the first person who actually took abstract art very seriously, not only in writing, but more in his own practice. So this is one of his earliest one, possibly one of the earliest paintings that moved towards abstraction.
Did his art change to that? Was he a well-known artist prior to that abstract painting?
That's a very good question. No, I did not have those earlier paintings. He is known for his ink painting, oil painting, depictions of Chinese landscapes, especially southern Chinese villages that is dominated by the houses with white walls and black tiles. So
very traditional.
Not very traditional. He had modern art trainings in France. So he was, I'm sorry I don't have the pictures here, but I have to describe it to
that abstraction of.
He's actually.
What he was doing before, but abstracting.
Right. He's kind of a moving, we can still see it's not absolutely abstract at all, right? We see mountains, we see shapes, we see some houses hidden, right? But this is a big step for the Chinese from the left to the right. And he moved further to abstraction. But for him, this is not abstract, actually. Abstract in the sense of abstract expressionism. He sees this as wisteria, the vine trees, right? And leaves. So he tries to combine the Chinese way of looking, of thinking of abstraction and the Western way of abstraction. To the Chinese, we have this tradition of what is called expressing ideas. If you speak Chinese, is Professor Han the only one who speaks Chinese here? 写意, literally meaning writing out our ideas. So it came from the Chinese tradition. And then you can see by the 1990s, now he's getting, although visually his works started to get very abstract, but in his titles he always has something in mind. something very, very representational in mind, right? See here, bright pearls among wild vines. And
How is this different? I'm sorry, I know we're supposed to wait for questions, but
no.
Just because I have it here,
No, this is
how
like
this
a,
different than early Chinese painting, like the Northern Song or the Southern Song, the literati painting, and how they're interpreting the landscape, but in a very abstract or very sort of meditative way. Is this sort of similar to that, or do you consider that abstraction, like way back? Like
yeah, I will mention some of the paintings from, from the
I'm
song.
just trying to figure out like where this abstraction.
Yes, I will mention some of the paintings, but not landscape though. Landscape is a totally different idea in the way of our understanding abstraction.
Chinese, I understand.
The Chinese, yes.
I think in the West it may be a very different way of thinking about that as well. So
Well, Chinese landscape is never abstract.
well, I guess that's my question, because it seems abstract if you look at it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To you, probably it's abstract, but Chinese painting, if we think of Fan Kuan's The Streams and Mountains, right? It's not about, I always talk about this in class, it's not about how a landscape is being seen. It's not about viewing a landscape, wow, this is great. No. This is about creating a path, imagined path for your spiritual journey. So to the Chinese, we don't call it landscape, we call it sanctuary, right? Why is a sanctuary? You think of mountains and waters. It's a world for you to travel spiritually, not for you to admire, wow, the proportions, the perspective. There's no such a thing. It's a world created for you to, it's like the Chinese garden. Have you ever been to a private Chinese garden in Suzhou? If in a garden and a Paris, like a palace garden, you can compare, right? In the Chinese garden, you have to walk in order to see everything, to understand. So the Chinese landscape painting is very much the two-dimensional version of a Chinese private garden. To live, to walk, to travel. And there's always a spiritual destination somewhere in the painting. So that's your purpose. It's for travel. So not for looking. If you're looking, wow, this is too dark, this part is too dark, okay, negative space, positive space, this is what we talk about, right, in class.
Right.
When you teach about Asian Chinese art. I don't think you're missing the main point. It's not about negative, positive. Sometimes we don't care about negative, positive. Sometimes all negative, sometimes all positive, right? The purpose, the true purpose is about traveling. Why do we have to travel in nature? Because we need to, the Chinese believe that we could only achieve peace when we live in harmony between heaven and earth. It's nature.
How is that different than this artist who's doing the wisteria or the wild vines? And in a lot of ways, like just from me looking at it, I feel like that's a journey as well, right? That's a way to travel, to look at this space or see it in a different light or see it in a different way. How is this different traditionally than, say,
That's a good point. I know what you're trying to ask.
wrinkles on an old man's
Right,
ears or whatever, like all those ink techniques?
Is it still the idea of traveling here at all?
That, but I do. I see it like that. Yeah.
Not as in the Song Dynasty, because that kind of spirit is gone.
Okay.
Through Mao's ears, all the so-called tradition has been shattered, has been buried. So Wu Guanzhong, people like him who was trained both in China and in France, he had new ideas, he had new hopes, because in the 1980s, we were open, we were trying to embrace everything from outside, because we have been suffering for so many decades without knowing anything about this world, right? If we had a friend or relative driving a second-hand car in the United States, that was greatest news to us, even though it was a second-hand car, right? So this is different. He was trying to combine something from the East and from the West. He wanted to create something new. It's no longer the traditional sanctuary any longer, because the spirit of sanctuary doesn't exist. It's like the we need your finger again, sorry. If you learned or taught about Asian art, we probably have heard of the shrine culture, the family shrine, right? Before the Cultural Revolution, every family had a family shrine, right, or a clan. But in the Cultural Revolution, everything is gone, right? So that spirit has disappeared. I'm sorry, you had a
I have a
question.
question. Is it kind of the spiritual journey that they're on? Is it because Pollock was reaching for the inner world, the spiritual world? So was that parallel to the Chinese?
This has always been, it's a very different spiritual. The spiritual journey to the Chinese is the spiritual world between heaven and earth in connection with nature. That's our understanding of the spirit. It's very different, but for Pollock, painting is a way that reveals the innermost, the self, right? The emotions, the feelings, right? From the unconscious. It's very different to the Chinese, who are not even familiar with the term of the unconscious yet in the 1980s. But our Shen is S-H-E-N. It's a little different. Shen could be translated as the soul, as the spirit. So it's slightly different from what you mean by the spirit here. So here, that kind of spirituality, I don't think is the most important thing for him to express. Because in Pollock's painting, those lines are not very controlled, not designed, right? But here, you can see, it's even, right? It's designed. He knows how to follow how the vines, spread. So he had a strong sense of design rather than spontaneous. So, sorry. Sorry. So that sense of spontaneity is different from what we saw in Jackson. I will make a comparison later.
Sorry to bring it.
No. It's great. It's great.
Clarified it for me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great when you ask questions. I don't fall asleep. As we all know, right? When you teach, nobody asks questions, then you fall asleep. If we ask questions, we are kind of excited to answer questions, right? This is the animation I mentioned. So I have this animation. So to him, the Chinese always try not to acknowledge any influences from the West, although they were, right? But here, Wu Guanzhong said, I was more inspired by the Ming Dynasty artist, the Xu Wei on the left side, Ming Dynasty. I should have the caption here. Oh, here. On the left side, this was done somewhere probably in as we know, 16th century at least, right? And then that kind of Shen or spirituality is there. So in the Chinese culture, we never take the physical appearance, likeness, as our uttermost goal. We say the spiritual likeness. What the heck do you mean by spiritual likeness, right? We never have a clear description about the Shen Si in Chinese. Spiritual likeness, you get that kind of the spirit, the soul, it's very hard for me to explain what this is. The resonance, sometimes it's translated as resonance of the spirit, right? As the so-called 6 laws from Xie He, I think it's called a resonance. That's one of the translations by James Cahill, probably. So anyway, we do see some kind of connection, probably, as Mr. Wu said, with Xu Wei or with the Chinese, as you said, literati. Yeah. The Chinese literati. They are more interested, and literati, the Chinese so-called Xie Yi painting started somewhere from the Song Dynasty with the rise of the literati class, right? And then, because they were amateurs, they didn't have to think about a market. They don't have to sell any paintings. The literati, the amateurs say, if I like, I do it. If I don't, I just don't, right? They never sell works. They just give away as gifts or exchanges. So anyway, as art historians, we all know we don't, some of you guys are artists, right? We don't have always to believe everything an artist says, right? I'm so sorry if you're an artist, but we still have to take what they say seriously, right? Are you an art historian or you're
Artist.
You're an artist. I'm so sorry. I do take your words seriously. And you can see here, autumn color on the wall. There's still the vine, the picture of the vine, but he sees those in the dots and lines, not his own spirit, but the spirit of nature. So this is very different in our way. So although this is kind of expressionism, but expressionism of yourself or expressionism of your understanding of nature. I think he's trying to combine both here, especially because he came from a background of traditional Chinese painting and Western modern art training. So there's this sense of hybridity in many of his paintings, especially in his later ones. And he came to the United States. His first year was 1989. He had a show in San Francisco. He traveled to New York, Boston, Detroit, Chicago. You know, he went to many places, and this was done after he went back to China. I don't know if he saw Jackson Pollock. He must have if he was in New York. And I think here, there's another one, Free Wandering. This is a little closer to what Jackson Pollock is, right? Jackson Pollock was free wandering, something like that. But he's free wandering in nature, rather, among the mountains and waters. And if we compare these two, they do seem to have things in common, right? Kind of a free wandering and layers of paint and lines, right? And then all over, painting. But what Mr. Wu does not have is dripping. He was painted. All the dots were actually painted. So when you are not dripping those colors, or when you are dotting them, you are doing this kind of rationally. You know where to put all those, right? When you drip, you don't know. This is accidental. So there is this difference, control. The Chinese never lose their mind when they do painting, I think. Right? We're always very controlled. Even when the Huaisu, I will show you part of the Huaisu, Mr. Huaisu who did the cursive. It's called Kuangcao, wildly cursive calligraphy, which many abstract Chinese artists refer to, right? He was said to be deadly drunk, but when you are deadly drunk, you can do nothing, right? He could still, do one of the best-known cursive styles. So I doubt whether that was true. Maybe just perfect, right? He was like 40% drunk. That's the best. You artists know better than art historians. Okay. It's hard for art historians to get drunk, you know that? Anyway, in the 1980s, the younger generation artists, they tried to break away from two traditions. The communist tradition, socialist realism, and the traditional Chinese tradition. Because they believed, in the 1980s, they believed that everything Chinese was a burden. Okay, we have to get away, but now today, everything Chinese we have to embrace. What a change within the past 30 years. So this is a genius. Huang Ping, probably many of you guys have heard of his name. He was one of the founding members of the China Dada, Xiamen Dada. And then he migrated to France, and he was a French citizen. He had a show in this country at Mass MoCA and at the Guggenheim Museum, right? And what he created is very interesting. He created something that's called accidental painting, like a random painting. You can see he created a spinning wheel, on top of which there's a kind of a diagram arranged according to the Bagua, the I Ching, the yin and yang sign. And he would spin the wheel, and then according to the instruction, because the I Ching has a lot of instructions, right? You guys know the feng shui system, where to locate your bed in your room, right? Never put it in between the door and the window, things like that. Anyway, if you believe in it, everything is true. So anyway, he did this, and then according to the instructions, say, okay, put something red and blue, or this direction, this way. So all these paintings were created in this way, in a fashion. So very interesting. It's an interesting way to get away from socialist realism and some connection with the tradition, but a new way of interpretation. And this is.
Do you see a connection between this and Chan's work, such as by John Cage?
I don't know the flow of influence, but John Cage was. I'm not sure John Cage was known back in the early 1980s yet in China, yeah. But John Cage was known in the late 1980s and 1990s. And today, probably his name is not as well known as Jackson Pollock or as Marcel Duchamp. And one of the best known names in China is actually Joseph Beuys, strangely. So anyway, many of the ideas started pouring into China by the mid-1980s and late 1980s. Then we had a kind of a hiccup by the late 1980s and early 1990s because of the Tiananmen Square. I have to say massacre. And then this is a Johann from Shanghai. Shanghai artists were different from the Beijing artists. They had more access to the Western art world, at Western cultures. And so Johann was trying to experiment. And then I'm just going, I had 45. Oh, okay, I have to rush a little bit. And those artists are either art school instructors or art school students. For example, this guy, Monludin, he was a student at CAFA. He spent at least 5 years in training with drawing. You know, those of you who know what drawing means to the Chinese, right? This is the most important foundational courses in China. They span 4 years at a middle school, high school, affiliated art high school, then first 2 years, 5 to 6 years doing nothing but drawing. You have to get anatomy correct, you have to get everything correct. But then you can see when he graduated, he totally broke away from that tradition. So socialist realism, which was adopted from Soviet Union, and many of them actually came from the European academic realism. So as a way of saying goodbye to communist ideology, and sometimes the Chinese artists, they don't actually know who is who in those movements, right? Not exactly, but they go by the images. For example, we see a little bit of Jackson Pollock, a little bit of de Kooning, right? And then sometimes a little bit of Franz Klein. So they try to mix the things together to create something they claim to be their own. So that it's like the invention of we have iPhone in this country, we have high phone in China. Have you ever heard of high phone in China? So by adding an H It's our creation. So anyway, okay, the second part, abstraction is a way of self-expression in a special social and political context. I guess you know what I mean, right? 1989, when the Tiananmen massacre happened, I belong to that generation. I spent days and nights on the Tiananmen Square. I was almost arrested, thanks to an old lady in my neighborhood who alerted me, the cops are looking for you. I didn't kill anybody, but I spent hours and hours hanging over the trucks loaded with soldiers, telling them, go back to your camps, right? So over and over again for hours. So they noted me. I was an art school student, so I had extremely long hair, longer than yours. And then they recognized me right away. And I was living with my then girlfriend, later wife, in a hutong. Those of you who have been to Beijing, right? In a hutong house. So in a hutong neighborhood, everybody knows everybody. So they know me. And then she told me, go back to your hometown. I was born in southern China, in Jiangsu, but I went to college in Beijing. So I went back to my hometown that night. So that kind of a special social and political context that was very suffocating for us. A few years after that, we couldn't actually get back on our feet. It's so difficult. Many of us couldn't take it. And one of the ways to show your silent protest is to have your head shaved. You just shave your hair without saying anything. But even if you have your hair shaved, you might get yourself into trouble, right? People will talk to you. So Fang Lijun was one of those guys, and you can see that's he's also a good friend of mine. We all from Kafa, and some of you guys may have seen this, right? Published on the New York Times magazine cover in 1993. And so in the early 1990s, for 3 years at least, artists didn't do anything because we were in a state of, now we understand that's called depression, right? We had no idea of such a concept of depression. Now we understand we had at least 3 or 4 years of depression. And so artists started to turn away from their socialist realism to something else. Now this is really when abstract art on larger scale started. People like Wang Yigang, who was an instructor, or a young professor at Lu Xun Art Academy in Shenyang in northeastern China. And he, I was talking with him on WeChat for this presentation. I said, Yigang, I'm going to mention you if you have anything to say. Unlike other Chinese artists, he frankly said, I admire Jackson Pollock and de Kooning. From the 1990s, I tried to learn everything they have done. So he's one of the guys who is very frank about his inspirations, his influences, which I really admire. I thanked him. And you can see, he tried to combine these, but in the meantime, he also tried to put the Chinese elements there, as we can see, right? Some of these strokes it's a little different on this a little pale than on the screen. But anyway, you can see the Chinese characters, Chinese calligraphy, not calligraphic yet. And then he started using something else. He dropped his brushes. He started to use his own body. And in the fashion here, right, he followed. And he frankly admitted, I was inspired not only by Jackson Pollock, but also by the Japanese artist, Japanese Gutai artist, I guess you guys know. Kazuo Shiraga, you can see Shiraga was doing painting in this way using one string, but Yigang he's using 2. So anyway, I was in his studio this past summer. Now, he was a very poor artist in the 1990s. Now he's very rich, extremely rich. He had like a 3,000 square meters studio / home. I was so surprised. You can see buckets and buckets of pure paint. Any of you guys can afford those buckets? I'm so sorry. I don't want to embarrass you, but I'm just trying to remind you that they're doing pretty well back then there. And then piled and piled. He has his own chef in his studio. I was like, oh, wow. So anyway, and then this was the time when the Chinese ink artists started experimenting with the possibility of abstraction. Now you might be interested in why Chinese artists abstract already? What kind of abstraction do you want? Okay, but they're trying to create something different, something new, something that illustrates the spirit of this age, right? Especially in the 20th century, especially after the Beijing Olympics. 2008 is the turning point of Chinese history in terms of nationalism. I was in China in 2008. I'm telling the truth, not like Tim Walz. I'm sorry. I'm a Tim Walz fan anyway. So, abstraction as a universal language in the era of globalization, right? China is the best beneficiary of globalization, but they also consider themselves the worst victim of globalization too. Maybe both are true, right? So the turning point is in the early 21st century, as I just mentioned, after 2008, the Olympics. And people even like Xu Bing and Cai Guoqiang, right? And even Ai Weiwei, those people started to look back at the tradition that left behind. Not the communist, the social realistic tradition, but the very tradition from before the 20th century, before the communists took over China. So they tried because they believe that this is something that they don't know, had no knowledge, because it was not educated in art schools in the 1960s or the 70s. So this is what I call a renegotiation and reconciliation with tradition, especially calligraphy and ink painting. And this is their major source of inspiration. People like Wang Dongling, I don't know if he had a show at Asia Society years ago. I don't know any of you guys have seen. And he was represented by Chambers Fine Arts, a gallery running in New York City for over 20 years. And you can see here, those of you who don't read Chinese, you may see Jackson Pollock, right? And those of you who do read Chinese, you see this is sloppy Chinese calligraphy. Right? This is the point. He calls his calligraphy messy calligraphy. This is the point he's trying to make. He actually came from a background of wonderful training in calligraphy. He could write all different scripts of Chinese calligraphy. But then he wanted to try something very different. And this is the thing I promise you I will get back to this. This is the Chinese, the tradition, not in landscape painting, but in figure painting and in what we call flower and bird painting, right? And there's a landscape painting. There's one by Qing Dynasty artist Shi Tao. I guess some of you guys may know, right? This has this kind of, abstraction in a way. But the point is not about the visuality of these lines and shapes and colors and dots, right? It's about the spirit of this man living alone in nature. That's the point, right? surrounded by all this shivering, vibrant, environment. Why? Because it's related to his own life. He was a Ming Dynasty, what we call the remnant loyalist. But then he was under the constant chase of the Manchus of the Qing Dynasty. This is how he had felt about himself. And here, up to the 20th century, you can see Qi Baishi. He came from, he trained himself basically as a painter, and he has always been considered the master of all masters of 20th century. He has some kind of abstraction, but in a very different way. So abstraction in the Chinese art is not just something visual, but something mental. And even Wang Dongling, you can see here, we think he has something in common with Abstract Expressionism. I do believe so. But he also, this is what he referred to. The title, the 1,000-character classic, is based on the emperor Song Huizong of the Song Dynasty, right? And he was actually borrowing much from the Japanese artist Yuichi Inoue. So these are some of all his works. And then ink painters. I don't know if it reminds of Franz Klein, right? Very much so. And then this guy, Qin Feng, it's called the Four Seasons. And they use massive brushes, and then they swing. This is very much like Jackson Pollock, actually, right? They swing, but it's controlled swing, you can see, right? Because it creates some pre-designed shapes. All right, so looking to the West, but thinking of, this is a very interesting part. This is what you are saying, that which one is the Chinese or the West? How do we tell, which part is the West, which part is the East? Looking to the West, but thinking of the East, the new Chinese perspective and the dilemma of Chineseness. Now, the Chineseness in the 1980s, for the first generation after the Reform age to the United States, right? Like all immigrants, early immigrants, they try not to speak their own language, right? You must learn English. That's your only language. And now we're bilingual, trilingual today, and we're proud of it. So the Chinese, they were very shy to talk about Chineseness earlier, but today, especially when in the globalization and when Chinese economy is moving up so fast, this changed many people into rethinking about this Chineseness. See, this is an oil on canvas painting, but the artist entitled this Ink Eagle. This is very interesting. So he thinks this was more inspired, his oil painting was more inspired by ink painting, like those we just saw, right? Like these. This is by Liang Ke from the Song Dynasty on the left side. And this eagle actually looks very much like the Buddhist monk. And this is the artist I was talking about, a younger generation of artists, although they are looking to the West, but they always think of the East. I mean, in techniques, in mediums, in materials, and in ways of doing painting, I think they're very Westernized. But then when they try to interpret their own works, they always bring in this Chinese dimension. And here, for example, he named this, he entitled this Huaisu Autobiography. It's a very famous calligraphy. The monk that I believed he was 40% drunk. This is the guy, this is the guy who did this cursive, wild cursive calligraphy even a trained Chinese may not be able to read the whole text. Because of the script. You have to be trained to read through the whole scroll. And here, so it's very interesting. I read their statements, I read their interviews, and they always refer to how much they were inspired by Chinese calligraphy. They always talk about how lines should be rendered in a painting. Sometimes they're not always true, I guess. And this guy, Qi Haiping, I know most of these guys. I worked with them over the past many decades. And Qi Haiping here, and he was also thinking of the mist of heaven and earth. Those are the Chinese philosophical cultural terms. And then this is a myriad phenomena of running cursive calligraphy. Where is, that's even worse than this screen because it's too pale. You cannot actually see. And then that's also calligraphy, writing calligraphy in space. And look how, it should be, 50. This 4 meters tall. So you need a big space, right? That means the Chinese are rich today. Right? Otherwise, you don't have such a space to have so big, right? And then even for artists like this guy, Chen Qiang, I thought I took a very close look at the painting. I thought that they were done with the staple nails, but then they were not. They were actually done with pencils. These are pencil marks. As of, I don't know how much calligraphic this is, but anyway, let me show you very quickly. We're running out of time.
And are women artists? Any women artists in this?
Abstract, that's a good question. That's my problem. I didn't find any woman abstract artists that I should brought. But in my other lectures, I always have a lot of women artists. I promise you. So I'm so sorry I probably don't have any, right? And you can see this, they were inspired by, Pollock, de Kooning, and even Cy Twombly, right? But in his interviews and writings and statements, he never mentioned Cy Twombly, or not even acknowledging his influence from Abstract Expressionism. And he's talking about how calligraphy affected him. And this is an artist who's much older. He was born in 1938. And he is probably one of the very few guys who did not try to make his painting with Chinese calligraphy. So anyway, that was just a very brief going through laughs and smiles with you guys. Not a very formal lecture. Thank you so very much. I can take some questions if we have time.
Absolutely. Does anybody have any questions right off the top?
Sure.
When they were doing their more traditional work, was it always ink, and then when they switched over to oils and acrylic, was that also modernism for them?
Yes, this, to give you a brief idea of what modern Chinese art is, in the 1920s, 30s, there were 2 ways to modernize the Chinese art. One is the academic realism. They thought that was modern, very modern in the Chinese context. The other is a group of artists who followed the steps of modernists, people like Lin Fengmian and others. So, but then it was terminated, this experimentation, and replaced by the social realism, not socialist, social realism, because of the breakup of the Japanese-Chinese War in 1937. Then after that, the communists took over. When the Japanese were defeated, there was a civil war in China, 4 years. Ended up, the communists took over China, and the nationalists went to Taiwan, right? They're still there in Taiwan. And China is trying to do something to take it over. And then from the 1950s all the way through the early 1980s, that's the socialist realism. But from the 80s, we have movement that's called a modern art, not necessarily modernist, but modern art movement, starting from the 1980s. I did not give a broader context, so you can see all different kind of styles of painting, from pop art to abstract art to installation to performance to installation to a lot of things. But this abstract expressionism is one of the many of the modern experimentations that they have been doing since the 1980s. So, but they all came from the background of very strict training in socialist realistic styles.
And that would have been with ink.
No, not ink, oil painting.
Oh,
Oil painting was introduced to China in the early 20th century. So they were known, but the few Chinese could afford the ink, the oil painting materials. But today we have our own factories that produce the oil painting materials today.
And Zhijian, in our
Yes.
preliminary talks about this topic, there was a very interesting aspect that you brought to my attention that I hadn't really considered, which is that, we're focusing on AbX influences today, but in the opening up of China, all of modernism was, Chinese viewers were exposed to all of modernism all at once in this simultaneity. So they were seeing Jackson Pollock at the same time as they were seeing Marcel Duchamp, etc. That sort of seeing the 20th century all in one fell swoop, what influence did that have, do you think, versus being exposed to these things in a linear way? For Chinese artists, how did seeing everything all at once from
It's very interesting. To make a comparison is that it's like the modernization of Chinese economy and urban culture in the past 3 decades. We just took the shortcut, right? So do you expect us to start from academic realism, then impressionism, post-impressionism? That doesn't make any sense, right? It's going to take us another 100 or even 200 years. I think it's not about the linear development of modern art, because history itself is very contingent, right? Modern art history is contingent as well. And today, our understanding of modernism is different. Art historians are talking about global modernism, right? And global modernisms with a plural. We have Latin American modernism, Asian modernism, African modernism. There is a book, I don't know if you are aware, written by a Kansas University professor. It's called Modern Art from something like a global perspective of modern art from 19th century to the present, published by Oxford University. I had the honor to be one of the reviewers. And that's very interesting because the author looks at the development, modern art from different perspectives. As I just mentioned, that academic realism was considered outdated, right, in Europe back then in early 20th century. Nobody was doing that. But when it was brought to China, they thought, wow, this is something so modern, right, in a different sense. in a different way because we have never studied human bodies like that. We don't bisect human bodies to understand, okay, the unit of the head is 1, 7, or 8 to the whole body. We never done that, right? As you just saw in that ink painting of Immortal, we just appreciate how the kind of a spirituality in that kind of a blurry shape of this model. So I think it's different. So we don't have a linear. Everything was happening at once. And in art history teaching or study, you may understand from the Impressionism all the way to today. But for artists, they just grab what they need, right? So it's like all of a sudden you have a banquet here. Should I skip any of the dishes here when you're at a banquet? No, they don't. That's why I said you have iPhone, we have iPhone. That's the idea. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. And then this other experience you have of translating what is sort of a very standard linear representation of Western art history. May I ask what you found in that process to be the most difficult concepts to translate from a Western reader to Chinese readers?
Well, a lot. Actually, in my translation, I made a lot of footnotes. For example, one of the key translations is minimalism to the Chinese language. Many of them translated as extremely simplism, something like that. I kept telling them, you have to translate minimalism from the literal meaning of the word, right? So I translate as 极少主义 if you speak Chinese, the minimal, the least available, right? But then the minimal doesn't mean simple. It's totally different. So I have to make a lot of footnotes to explain why this has to be translated this way. So translation is really difficult, especially Chinese language is very different. We don't have many words as you do. You have about 1 million words, right? Not all of them are in use. We only have like 3,000 characters to shovel around. Okay, so that's difficult.
I have a question. So Dr. Zhijan Qian is one of the top tier Chinese art history in Asian world, especially in art, who introduced Western art into the Asian academia and market. My question is more related to your research, which is, as an art historian, you have been kind of growing together with the whole reopening and opening up of the Asian history of art, then step kind of across the sea to look kind of with a distance in America, teaching in New York, then looking back to the art history in China and kind of rebuild the linear line in this lecture. And what is your focus right now? And what is your interest? Because you're curating, you're doing lectures and writing books. So what is your interest right now versus to looking back into the history? What are you focusing right now in the contemporary art world, and what are you looking for?
My interest is in the cross-cultural experiences of artists. And especially I'm interested in the interculturality in the works of contemporary artists. Starting from the spring, I will take some graduate students to advise them on working on the issues of contemporary art and cross-cultural studies. So that's what I do. And I'm especially interested in interculturality. Interculturality is nothing, although they try to claim things from a Chinese perspective, but there's no such a thing as purely Chinese today. It's like there's nothing purely American. It's the same thing. Everything, even if they're making high foam, it's partially American. Even if they're trying to make their own planes, most of the parts came from other countries. We're all living in a world. You must have been to a Chinese restaurant, right? So your stomach is no longer pure American. That's what I mean by interculturality, right? And they say, look at what I'm dressed. So this is not Chinese. Do you expect me to put on the long robe and tie up my hair? You know, I don't have much hair. So anyway, yeah, that's what I think. I've been living in this country for almost 28 years. And I've been traveling back and forth. 1 year I traveled 8 times back and forth. But usually I travel 2 or 3 times a year. So I know, as Professor Han said, I've been growing with this generation of artists. So I know them very well. I try to understand their way of thinking. I have arguments with them, I have good talks with them. So this is very interesting. And I think this is a best generation in modern Chinese art, because down the road, we don't know where Mr. Xi Jinping is taking us. So we're going down the road anyway, but you have to stop sometime.
How are Chinese students taught art now in China? What's changed?
Well, in the
Has
art
anything
world,
changed?
privately, nothing has changed. We still have space to do, their own thing. I'm good friends with Song Dong. Many of you guys probably know Song Dong and Yin Xiuzhen. They had a massive show in a massive museum in Langfang, which is near Beijing. It's like 2 hours drive from Beijing. It's like maybe 2 or 3 times of MoMA, that big. And a university museum is that size too. In Jingdezhen, the porcelain capital of China, I went to their porcelain university in China. And then their museum size shocked me. I said, I've never seen this size of a university museum that large. So they still have their freedom to do art in their own way. But what we are worried about is that because the government seems to be tightening the rope around the necks of people. For example, starting from this semester, college faculties cannot hold their private passports. They cannot travel to other countries freely. The government is taking back their passports. That's a signal. Why? They don't want to know what's going on in the rest of the world.
Closing the doors again. Yeah.
Exactly. That's why I miss the 1980s, because back then we thought, the door was open, and now the doors are closing. But if I hear from Song Dong calling me and say, help, help,
Oh, no.
then China will be in big problem.
Prior to college, though, are they being taught very, very traditional ways of art until they get to college?
Yes.
In training, yes. In training, you must spend years at a art school on drawing, simply
So
just
still
drawing.
years and years of
Yes, still,
And there
yeah.
is, I think that, we do have the opportunity to ask this to Han, who grew up in this in-between right now period and, born right at the end of the period that you just discussed in the late 80s. So Han, what was it like being an art student in the 90s and early 2000s?
So most are the same as Dr. Qian was saying, that training before college is a must, that you basically paint a photo reality of works before you enter into college, then started to understand the history of the world in art. than trying to develop your own. But that doesn't help because most of art professors are still on the road of discovering their own. So that's pretty much the job we need to do after college. And this is what the job that I was trying to discover around the show that displaying here. So refer to your question, yes, 4 to 5 or more years prep college on joints and oils.
So is a lot of that emulation as well, like trying to emulate existing artworks or existing artists and trying to get mastery of what they're doing rather than trying to head out or eke out on your own and trying to create your own voice? Because another question I had is how much of this is essentially taking all of this information, as you were saying, kind of sandwiching all at once, right? And sort of emulating the buffet, like kind of taking all of this stuff and putting it together just because of reverence of whatever they're seeing, right? That kind of excitement of the, you know, the chicken and the filet and all of these things that they can kind of put together on one plate, right? And how much of it is actually taking all of that and then turning it into something new or turning it into something that reflects Chinese culture, like which we see some of these artists eventually doing? Like how much of it is emulation and reverence and how much of it is actually, well, we're in a pluralistic mode right now. How much are we taking all of this in and we're going to try to create something new out of it? Because I mean, I find this a lot of my students, my intern students, there's a reluctance to create, and as a Western, you know, society, I'm like, no, do your own thing, right? Figure it out. No, don't copy that over here, right? Because that's already been done. Let's do something else, right? But I can understand from a different point of view if you're kind of coming from that culture, right? Coming from that way of learning, that doing your own voice is a hard thing, right? Because you're being taught to emulate the thing that already exists and do it well before you actually kind of move on. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a question there, but
it's a very good question. Emulation is part of the Chinese culture.
yeah.
You know, especially traditional landscape painters, calligraphers, they all emulate. And sometimes they spend their whole life emulating old masters. And then those works that I just showed you, you think they're emulations or they're their original. They think these are their originals. That's why they don't mention, you know, the abstract expressionist names. They always refer to calligraphy because this is so big, calligraphy, right? It's so abstract as well. So you probably have heard of the case of Ye Yongqing emulating Dutch artist. I don't know if you guys know that case, a very big case. He has been emulating that artist for 30 years. And then that artist is still not very rich, but Ye Yongqing has sold his paintings, sometimes just a plagiarism. They look so much like each other. But he has claimed those were his originals for the past 30 years. So strangely, some art historians, art critics in China, they defamed Ye Yongqing as, this is called appropriation art. I said, this is not appropriation, that's a totally different idea. You are simply taking something from an unknown, not very well-known artist.
The Dutch painter is living?
Yeah, I think Belgium or Dutch, I don't remember, but from that place.
Chinese artist rich from the
Very rich. My God, he's very rich. He's like probably a billionaire. And so anyway, yeah, so that's the thing. It's very hard to define, you know, the boundary between emulation and the creation, because this is in the Chinese culture. If you Qing Dynasty, a lot of artists, they show their paintings as, this is my painting, a copy of Shitao, and then sign it that way. That's the Chinese tradition. They're proudly showing you that, look, I understand Shitao very well, look at my copy. But look, I have all the trainings, but then I don't want to create something new. This is my work. I just love copying this. I'm following the steps. Like Qi Baishu said, I would rather be a dog at the feet of such a master rather than myself.
Why?
I enjoy it. I enjoy being a dog. Is that something to blame? That's the idea. So this is very different. So originality, creativity is, to many people, is not the thing they want. We did not have individualism before the end of Mao's time, right? So it's very different, yes.
That was going to be actually my question. I was thinking about after the Qing ended in about 1911 to the Civil War period, where you have growing nationalism with Sun Yat-sen, and then you have the warlord period after the fall of the Republic. I'm interested in the combining of, the West after the century of humiliation in the 19th century, and the desire for the Chinese to break away from the West, but the influence of the West before Mao takes full control in 1949. Kind of like if you had a pre-lecture to the one you just had from the early part of the 20th century. What's the influence there of the West on Chinese artists in the early 20th century?
French. But French through Japan earlier in the 1910s and 20s.
Right.
Then the Chinese sent students directly to Europe, but mostly France.
Okay.
So before, most of the Chinese couldn't afford going to France. They would send them to Japan because the Japanese culture was a little familiar to the Chinese. But after realizing the Japanese are teaching what the Europeans were doing, so what the heck, so they send them to...
Why French though? Because of the sphere.
France in the 1920s and 30s, especially Paris, was the center of modern art, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And some of them went to Berlin, London. Most of them stayed in Paris. Any other questions?
I was thinking about what Jason was saying. Jason and I both teach drawing. We have a huge Asian population at Stony Brook, and that is the sense of, I don't show examples. I want them to find their originality, and many of our students are insanely talented, but as far as the individual voice, there's a reluctance with taking ownership for their ideas. And part of what they often ask is like, well, what do you want me to do? So like, show me an example and I'll do it. And I'm like, I'm not showing you anything. I want you to like work with the lesson and see where it takes you. And I think that it's a very uncomfortable position for them to be in with us.
Because
It was intrusive on my part to insist on that. But we also we show many representations of Asian art, like, okay, I know that this is somewhere part of your cultural history as well as your education, so draw upon that as well as your Western exposure, and most students do take art history classes, and then find your voice. And even then, it's hard. It's like a harder lesson.
It's hard.
They have to undo some of the rigidity and the respect for maybe previous teachers that maybe gave them too many rules.
Not the rules, but that's a good question. As a student myself here, now I'm a professor here, so I know from both sides. First of all, we Chinese are very shy. Second of all, we don't want to make mistakes. Thirdly, we don't want to take any blames. So if I did something and I don't even like it, I don't want to show it to you. And then if I wanted to show you, I would be very nervous. Is she going to say something bad about me? This is something I cannot take, from a Chinese student. And then you have to tell them why this is important, right? To be yourself is because we come from a culture that's called Confucianism, right? And collectivism. This is our thing. So in this country, everybody, you want to be your own. In the Chinese Confucianist culture, we want to be the best. Not your own, the best. That's why we have tiger moms, right? That's why. So you don't want to be weak. You always want to be the best, right? So I ask my students, if I could not be the best? Your parents say, go kill yourself. Seriously, they do say so. My grandma told me that when I was little, because I love swimming in the rivers. And then she hated that. And then if I don't obey, then you just kill yourself. That's a different culture. So
We can't say that.
of course. Of course, we cannot. Well, parents today, they don't say this either. So I was talking about decades ago. But you have to we have to read their mind, try to tell them that you won't be punished, right? You won't have negative points. You have to understand.
Talking about how, here, we I don't know how much this is true anymore, but there's something to be learned from failure, even, and growth from failure.
We don't understand this.
You don't understand that.
No,
Yeah.
we don't. We don't take failures.
Explain that it's
We're all Donald Trump. We don't take failures. So it's very different. It's difficult, but now it has changed over the past 3 decades. The Chinese younger generation have changed so much. So it's even more difficult if you deal with people from the 40 years ago, the older generations. You probably know this. We always say the Chinese never apologize, right? The Chinese government never apologized to anything. The balloons, they didn't say sorry. Sorry, oh, that was a mistake. We didn't mean to send the balloons over your country. They never apologized. That's part of the culture. But my generation has changed, and I always apologize to my wife all the time.
That's important.
So, yeah, we still have hope.
In terms of that question specifically, Han and I on our podcast, plug for the podcast, the Pollock-Krasner podcast, we talked extensively about that. You felt that coming out of your education in China, you had a lot of technical proficiency, but that the struggle was then to find your own voice and figure out who you were. And that was the one thing that you said wasn't taught so much. And you would eventually, you got an MFA in China, then you also got one at Pratt. So you got education on both sides there. But one thing that I really like about this exhibition that you don't like as much as I like is the inclusion of works from, when you got out of art school. So there's the Bathers series, which Han did in 2012, all the way up to present works that kind of follow your journey from being a very young woman in China to living and working in the US now for about 10 years. And I think you can see a move towards finding your voice there. And I do want to encourage everybody to look at the exhibition and talk to Han about it. I know some of us have to go soon, so I do want to break a little bit and move into a more informal format now where we can mingle and talk. We'll also open up the studio if anybody wants to go over there and hasn't been over there yet. But yeah, we talked a lot about that, Han.
Yes.
About finding voice.
Very quickly, just the conceptual part and the skill teaching part in Chinese art education is separate. Basically, no conceptual part. So this is the part I value a lot in my US education, which is finding your own voice of trying different paths. So I tried a lot, and you can see a lot from this exhibition, and finally combined into complex for me, I think. But the skill part, technical setting, preparation, and foundation is the core of getting my hands and eyes and brain work together. So I also interested in the U.S. actually art fundamental art education, which is lack of seriousness at some point. And that is important to bring the skill up and leads the way to a self-exploration. That is something that I think that should be more emphasis on. But the core part of US art education in conceptual building is essential, and which leads the center of American creativity that's still exploring and flourishing. And that's from my own experience, both education to MFAs in both worlds. And those are some works, and I would love to take some questions later on. Thank you, Matt.
And thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Dr.